The explosion that killed Kade Garrison's father also stole every sound from his world. And now, at 24 years old, he could still smell the black powder that had collapsed the mine shaft when he closed his eyes at night. He stood in front of the general store in Oatman, Arizona, watching people's mouths move without understanding their words, feeling the familiar ache of isolation that had become his constant companion since that day 6 years ago. The June sun blazed overhead in 1883, turning Main Street into a shimmering ribbon of dust and heat, and Cade adjusted his wide-brimmed hat lower over his eyes as he loaded supplies onto his horse. Someone tapped his shoulder, and he turned to find old Mr. Henderson pointing frantically down the street. Cade followed his gesture to see a crowd gathering near the edge of town, where the road curved toward the mountains. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip before he remembered that most troubles in Oatman involved drunken miners rather than outlaws. He secured his supplies and walked toward the commotion, his boots kicking up small clouds of red dust with each step. The crowd parted slightly, and Cade saw her for the first time. She stood beside a broken wagon wheel, her dark hair falling in waves past her shoulders, her traveling dress dusty from the road. Her face was flushed from the heat, and what appeared to be frustration as she gestured to an older man who must have been her father. Cade couldn't hear what anyone was saying, but he could read the concern on the faces surrounding them. The older man clutched his side, and even from a distance, Cade could see the grimace of pain twisting his features. Cade pushed through the crowd until he stood close enough to see the young woman's face clearly. She had green eyes that caught the sunlight, and her lips moved rapidly as she spoke to the town doctor who had arrived moments before. Cade watched those lips, trying to piece together words from the shapes they made, but she spoke too quickly for him to follow. The doctor examined the older man and shook his head, his expression grave. The young woman's face crumpled with worry, and Cade felt something shift in his chest. He stepped forward and touched her elbow gently to get her attention. When she turned to face him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Cade pointed to himself, then to the wagon, then made a gesture he hoped conveyed his offer to help. She stared at him with confusion, her lips forming words he couldn't decipher. He pulled a small notebook and pencil from his vest pocket, something he had started carrying after losing his hearing. In careful letters he wrote, "I can help fix wagon. Where are you staying?" She took the notebook from his hands, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. She read his words and then looked back up at him with an expression of relief mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. She wrote beneath his question, "We have no place yet. Father hurt. Need doctor. Thank you." Cade read her words and nodded. He pointed to the doctor, then to the boarding house across the street, then gestured as though carrying the older man. The woman nodded vigorously and turned to relay this information to the doctor. Cade watched her lips move as she spoke, noting how her mouth formed each word with an expressiveness that made him want to understand every syllable. Several men helped carry the injured man to the boarding house, while Cade examined the broken wagon. The wheel had cracked badly, probably from hitting one of the countless rocks that littered the desert roads. He could fix it, but it would take time and materials. He looked up to find the young woman standing beside him again, this time with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She spoke to him and he shook his head, tapping his ear and then gesturing to show he couldn't hear. Her eyes widened with understanding and she immediately reached for the notebook he still held. She wrote, "I am Elena Voss. My father is Thomas. We came from California looking for mining opportunities. How can I repay your kindness?" Cade read her words twice, his eyes lingering on her name. Elena. It suited her somehow, elegant and strong at the same time. He wrote back, "I am Kade Garrison. No payment needed. I will fix the wagon tomorrow. Your father needs rest tonight." Lena read his words and her shoulders relaxed slightly. She wrote, "You are very kind. May I help you with the repairs? I do not want to be useless while my father recovers." Kade felt a smile tug at his lips, the first genuine one in longer than he could remember. He nodded and wrote, "Meet me here at sunrise. Bring water. Hot tomorrow." She smiled back at him, and the sight of it made his heart beat faster. He watched as she walked back toward the boarding house, her skirts swishing with each step, and he found himself already anticipating the morning. That night, Kade lay in his small cabin on the outskirts of town and thought about Elena's face, about the way her eyes had softened when she realized he couldn't hear, about how she hadn't looked at him with pity, but with understanding. He had grown accustomed to the way people treated him in Oatman, either speaking too loudly as though volume would somehow reach him, or avoiding him altogether, because conversation required too much effort. But Elena had simply adapted, had found a way to communicate without hesitation or awkwardness. Sleep came slowly in the oppressive heat, and when dawn finally broke across the desert, Kade was already dressed and heading into town. He stopped by the workshop where he sometimes took carpentry jobs and gathered the tools and what he would need for the wagon repair. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete, waved at him and wrote on a chalkboard they kept for their communications, "You helping that pretty girl with the broken wagon?" Kade nodded and Pete grinned, clapping him on the shoulder before returning to his own work. Kade loaded the materials onto a small cart and pulled it down the street toward where the wagon still sat at the edge of town. The sun was barely up, but already he could feel the heat building, promising another scorching day. Elena arrived just as he was setting out his tools. She carried a large canteen of water and a basket that smelled of fresh bread. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made the early morning effort worthwhile. She set down her burden and pulled out the notebook, writing, "I brought breakfast. You cannot work on an empty stomach." Kade felt warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the rising sun. He wrote back, "Thank you. You did not have to do that." She wrote, "I wanted to. The boarding house woman was kind enough to let me use her kitchen this morning." They sat in the shade of the broken wagon and shared the bread along with some cheese and dried fruit Elena had packed. Kade was acutely aware of how close she sat to him, how her shoulder occasionally brushed against his. She didn't try to make conversation while they ate, seeming to understand that constantly passing the notebook back and forth would make the meal cumbersome. Instead, she simply sat companionably beside him, and Kade found the silence comfortable in a way he rarely experienced with others. After they finished eating, Kade stood and gestured to the wagon wheel. Elena rose as well and watched intently as he demonstrated what needed to be done. He pointed to the cracked spokes and then to the new wood he had brought, showing her how he would need to remove the old pieces and fit the new ones. She nodded her understanding, and when he handed her a tool, she took it without hesitation. They worked together throughout the morning, and Kade found himself constantly aware of Elena's presence beside him. She was a quick learner, following his wordless instructions with an intuition that surprised him. When she didn't understand something, she would tap his arm and point questioningly, and he would demonstrate again until she nodded with comprehension. The lack of spoken words between them felt less like a barrier and more like their own private language. Around midday, the heat became intense enough that Kade insisted on a break. They moved to the deeper shade on the north side of the wagon, and Elena poured water from the canteen into 2 tin cups she had brought. As they drank, she pulled out the notebook and wrote, "How long have you been deaf?" Cade appreciated her directness. He wrote back, 6 years. Mining accident. My father died in the same explosion. Elena's face filled with sympathy and she wrote, I am so sorry. That must have been terrible. He nodded and wrote, it was, but I have learned to live with it. What brings you and your father to Arizona, she wrote. My father dreamed of finding silver. My mother passed away 2 years ago and he needed a new purpose. I could not let him travel alone, so here I am. Cade read her words and felt a kinship with her loss. He wrote, Oatman has gold, not silver. But there are opportunities for those willing to work hard. Elena wrote, My father will be glad to hear that. The doctor says he has several broken ribs and needs at least 2 weeks of rest before he should consider any strenuous activity. Cade considered this and wrote, There are good boarding options here. Mrs. Patterson runs a clean house and her prices are fair. Elena wrote, That is where we are staying now. She has been very kind. They returned to work on the wagon, and as the afternoon wore on, Cade found himself stealing glances at Elena. The physical labor had brought a flush to her cheeks, and a few strands of hair had escaped her bun to curl against her neck. She caught him looking once and smiled, and he quickly turned back to his work, feeling heat in his face that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. By late afternoon, the wagon wheel was repaired. Cade tested it carefully, rolling it back and forth to ensure the new spokes would hold. Elena watched anxiously until he gave her a thumbs up, and then she clapped her hands together with delight. She wrote in the notebook, You are very skilled. Thank you so much, Cade wrote. You helped more than you know. Good assistant. She laughed, and he felt the vibration of it, even though he couldn't hear the sound. He found himself wishing desperately that he could hear her laughter, wondering what it sounded like, whether it was light and musical or rich and full. The wish surprised him with its intensity. He had long ago made peace with his silent world, but suddenly he wanted to hear again with a fierce longing that caught him off guard. Elena wrote, My father will want to thank you properly. Will you come to dinner tonight? Mrs. Patterson serves at 6 o'clock. Cade hesitated. He usually avoided social meals because they were difficult for him to navigate. People forgot he couldn't hear and would speak to others while he sat in confused isolation, or they would try too hard to include him and make everything awkward. But the hopeful expression on Elena's face made him nod his agreement. She smiled brilliantly and wrote, Wonderful. I will see you then. Cade watched her walk back toward the boarding house, his heart doing strange things in his chest. He gathered his tools slowly, his mind already jumping ahead to dinner, to seeing Elena again, to the possibility of more time in her company. He returned to his cabin and washed thoroughly, scrubbing away the dust and sweat of the day's work. He put on his cleanest shirt and even attempted to tame his dark hair, which always seemed to have a mind of its own. As he looked at himself in the small mirror, he wondered what Elena saw when she looked at him. Did she see only a deaf man, limited and damaged, or did she see something more? He arrived at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house exactly at 6 o'clock. The main dining room was full of boarders and a few townspeople who paid for meals. Elena spotted him immediately and waved him over to a table where she sat with her father. The older man's face was pale and tight with pain, but he smiled when Cade approached. Elena had clearly explained the situation to her father because Thomas Voss immediately reached for the notebook. He wrote with a slightly shaky hand, Thank you for helping my daughter today. You have been a blessing to us. Cade wrote back, Happy to help. How are you feeling? Thomas wrote, Like a horse kicked me, but the doctor says I will heal, just need time and rest. Mrs. Patterson brought out plates of roasted chicken, potatoes, and vegetables. Cade was relieved that the meal provided a natural reason not to constantly write back and forth. He ate slowly, aware of Elena sitting across from him. She caught his eye several times and smiled, and each time he felt that strange flutter in his chest. After the meal, Elena wrote, "Would you like to take a walk?" The evening air might be pleasant. Kade glanced at Thomas, who waved them away with a knowing smile. They stepped out into the cooling evening and walked slowly down Main Street. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Elena didn't reach for the notebook immediately, and Kade appreciated that she seemed content to simply walk beside him. They reached the edge of town where a few scraggly trees provided a bit of green against the endless brown landscape. Elena finally wrote, "This place is so different from California, but I think I might grow to love it," Kade wrote. "It takes time to adjust to the desert, but it has its own beauty." She wrote, "Tell me about yourself. What do you do besides fix wagons?" He wrote, "I do carpentry work. Build furniture, repair buildings, whatever needs doing. I also have a small claim at one of the mines, but it barely pays for supplies." She wrote, "Do you have family here?" He wrote, "No. My father was my only family." She wrote, "Just my father now. I have an aunt in San Francisco, but we have not spoken in years. She disapproved of my father's dreams." They sat beneath one of the trees, the notebook passing back and forth between them as the sky darkened. Kade learned that Elena was 22 years old, that she loved reading and had brought a trunk full of books with her from California, that she missed the ocean but was excited for new adventures. She learned that Kade had learned carpentry from his father, that he had taught himself to read lips, though it was difficult and unreliable, that he sometimes felt like a ghost moving through a world he could no longer fully access. When it grew too dark to write clearly, Elena touched his hand to get his attention. Even in the dimness he could see her expressive face, and she pointed to her lips. Then slowly, deliberately, she mouthed words he could see clearly in the moonlight. "Thank you for today." He understood her perfectly, and the realization sent a thrill through him. He pointed to his own lips and spoke, though he couldn't hear himself and never knew if his words sounded right. "You are welcome." She smiled and nodded, letting him know he had spoken clearly enough. They walked back to the boarding house together, and when they parted at the door, Kade felt the loss of her presence like a physical thing. Over the next several days, a pattern emerged. Kade would finish his carpentry work by early afternoon and would meet Elena somewhere in town. Sometimes they sat in the shade, and she would read to him from her books, though he couldn't hear the words. Instead, he watched her lips form each sentence, piecing together the story from the shapes her mouth made. It was exhausting work, and he only caught perhaps half of what she read, but he never asked her to stop because watching her face as she read was its own reward. Other times, they would walk out into the desert in the relative cool of evening, exploring the rocky landscape together. Elena had a curiosity about everything and wanted to know the names of every plant and creature they encountered. Kade found himself borrowing books from the small town library, so he could give her the information she craved. On the 5th evening after they met, they sat by a small campfire Kade had built a short distance from town. The flames danced between them, casting moving shadows across Elena's face. She had been speaking while he watched her lips, and he caught fragments. "Never expected. Find someone. Understand." He shook his head in frustration and pointed to his eyes, then to her mouth, then made a slowing gesture with his hand. Elena immediately understood. She took a breath and began again, speaking much more slowly. He watched intently as her lips formed each word with deliberate care. "I never expected to find someone who understands me like you do." His heart hammered in his chest because he had understood every word, had seen them clearly in the firelight. He spoke aloud, hoping his words came out right. I feel the same way about you." She nodded eagerly to let him know she had understood him. Then she spoke again, even slower this time. "You make me feel safe." "Seen," he responded, "you make me feel less alone." They stared at each other across the fire, and Kade felt something fundamental shift in his world. This woman had entered his life only days ago, but already she had changed everything. She didn't treat his deafness as something to be overcome or pitied. She simply adapted, found ways to bridge the gap between them, acted as though communication through notebooks and careful lip reading was the most natural thing in the world. Elena spoke again, slowly. "Will you teach me sign language? I have heard there are schools back east where deaf people learn to speak with their hands." Kade felt emotion tighten his throat. He wrote in the notebook, "I only know a few signs. No one here uses sign language, but I can teach you what I know." She wrote, "Teach me. I want to learn every way to talk to you." Over the next week, they met every evening by the campfire, and Kade taught Elena the limited signs he had learned from a traveling preacher who had passed through Oatman years before. She was an eager student, practicing each gesture until she could make it smoothly. She taught him signs she invented on her own, and they created their own private vocabulary, a language that belonged only to them. Her father recovered slowly, and Kade helped Thomas find work as a bookkeeper for one of the larger mining operations. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and didn't require physical labor. Thomas was grateful and made it clear that he approved of the time his daughter spent with Kade. One evening as they sat by their campfire, Elena spoke more slowly than ever before, her lips forming each word with exaggerated care. "I think I am falling in love with you." Kade's breath caught. He had been raised to be cautious with his heart, to protect himself from rejection and disappointment. But looking at Elena across the fire, seeing her beautiful face illuminated by the flames, watching the honesty and vulnerability in her expression, he knew he felt exactly the same way. He spoke carefully. "I know I am falling in love with you." She smiled then, the most radiant smile he had ever seen, and his heart felt too large for his chest. She stood and walked around the fire to sit beside him. She took his hand in hers, threading their fingers together, and they sat that way for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers while the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Arizona sky. The next morning, Kade woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He went to the small workshop and began building something new, something that had nothing to do with any commission or job. He worked through the day and into the evening, his hands moving with practiced skill, shaping wood into something beautiful. 3 days later, he finished the rocking chair. It was made of smooth pine with careful joinery and a gently curved back. He had carved a pattern of desert flowers along the top rail, every petal and leaf detailed with painstaking precision. It was the finest piece of furniture he had ever made, and he had built it thinking of Elena with every cut and stroke. He brought the chair to the boarding house and carried it up to the room Elena shared with her father. When she opened the door and saw what he held, her hands flew to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. Thomas stood behind her and nodded his approval, clapping Kade on the shoulder. Elena pulled out their notebook and wrote, "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. You made this for me." Kade wrote, "For you. So you have something comfortable for reading your books." She threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly, and Kade felt the rightness of holding her, of having her close. When she pulled back, she spoke slowly, "I love it. I love you." He cupped her face gently in his hands and spoke the words he had been holding inside. "I love you too." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and Kade felt like he was falling and flying at the same time. When they broke apart, Thomas was politely examining something interesting on the ceiling, and Elena was laughing, and Kade felt joy more complete than any sound could have given him. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Kade's life. He and Elena spent every possible moment together, learning each other's rhythms and patterns, building a life that made sense for both of them. She continued to speak slowly when addressing him directly, and he became better at reading her lips with each passing day. She learned more signs and taught some to her father, and even to Mrs. Patterson, who proclaimed it a lovely way to communicate. When Thomas felt well enough, Kade took both Vosses out to see his small mining claim. It wasn't much, just a narrow shaft dug into the side of a mountain, but Thomas examined it with an expert eye and declared that Kade had been digging in the wrong direction. Together they mapped out a new approach, and Thomas's expertise in geology proved invaluable. One sweltering afternoon in late July, nearly 2 months after Elena had arrived in Oatman, Kade was working in the mine shaft when his pickaxe struck something different from the usual rock. He brought his lantern closer and saw the telltale glimmer of gold ore, a thick vein running deep into the mountain. His heart began to race as he traced the vein with his fingers, estimating its size and potential value. He emerged from the mine covered in dust and nearly ran the 3 miles back to town. He found Elena at the boarding house, sitting in her rocking chair with a book in her lap. She looked up when he burst in, and his excitement must have been clear on his face because she immediately set her book aside. He grabbed the notebook, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote, "Found gold. Big vein. Very big." Elena read his words and then looked up at him with wide eyes. She wrote, "Are you certain?" He nodded vigorously and wrote, "Your father should come see." "But yes, I am certain." Thomas confirmed it the next day, and within a week Kade had registered the expanded claim and hired a small crew to begin proper extraction. The gold was high quality, and the vein was substantial enough that Kade knew his financial worries were over for the foreseeable future. More than that, it meant he could offer Elena the kind of life she deserved, could build them a real home instead of his small cabin. On a cool evening in early August, Kade took Elena on a ride out into the desert. He had packed supplies and they rode for nearly an hour until they reached a spot he had discovered weeks before, a natural outcropping of rock that provided a perfect view of the valley below and the mountains beyond. The sun was setting, turning the landscape into a painting of golds and purples. They dismounted and Kade spread a blanket on the ground. Elena sat beside him, her hand finding his naturally, their fingers intertwining as they had so many times before. They watched the sunset in comfortable silence until the first stars began to appear. Then Kade turned to face her and pulled out a small wooden box he had made himself. Elena's breath hitched as he opened it to reveal a gold ring with a small but beautiful nugget of natural gold as its centerpiece. It was raw and unpolished, catching the last light of day with an inner glow. He spoke carefully, hoping every word came out right. "Elena Voss, you have given me back my life. You see me as whole even when I cannot hear. You learned my language and taught me yours. You are my heart and my home. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Elena's face as she nodded emphatically. She spoke slowly, clearly. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and in that moment Kade felt like the luckiest man alive. His silence didn't matter. His disability didn't define him, because Elena loved him exactly as he was. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Oatman. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle with pride, and half the town turned out to witness the union. The preacher had learned enough signs to incorporate them into the ceremony, which brought tears to Elena's eyes. When Kade spoke his vows, he did so without fear of how he sounded, because Elena's radiant smile told him everything he needed to know. Kade had built them a house on a piece of land just outside town, a sturdy adobe structure with large windows to catch the light and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings. He had crafted every piece of furniture himself, each item made with love and care. Elena filled the house with her books and the desert flowers she had learned to grow, creating a home that felt warm and welcoming despite the harsh landscape around them. Their life together fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Kade would work either at the mine or on carpentry projects during the day while Elena managed their household and helped her father with the bookkeeping for the mining company. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, and Elena would tell him about her day, speaking slowly and clearly so he could follow every word. He would respond, and she would listen with her full attention, never making him feel self-conscious about his voice. They developed elaborate systems of communication that worked perfectly for them. Elena would touch his shoulder or hand to get his attention before speaking. If she needed to tell him something quickly while his back was turned, she would move into his line of sight. They kept notebooks in every room of the house, and their invented sign language continued to grow and evolve. The mine prospered beyond anyone's expectations. The gold vein proved to be even larger than initially thought, and Kade hired Thomas to help manage the business side of the operation. Father and daughter worked together to ensure everything was handled properly, and the three of them became a tight family unit. One evening in early spring, nearly a year after their wedding, Elena took Kade's hand and placed it on her stomach. She spoke slowly, her face glowing with happiness. "We are going to have a baby." Kade felt joy explode through him. He pulled Elena into his arms, holding her carefully, reverently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had told him. A baby. Their baby. A child who would grow up in a home filled with love, who would learn from birth that there were many ways to communicate, many ways to connect with other people. He pulled back and spoke. "You have made me the happiest man in the world." She laughed and signed back. "And you have made me the happiest woman." The pregnancy was difficult at times in the desert heat, but Elena bore it with grace. Kade was constantly worried about her, hovering and fussing until she would laugh and gently push him away, signing that she was fine and he needed to relax. Thomas was equally excited about becoming a grandfather and began building a cradle in his spare time, his skilled hands creating something beautiful for his future grandchild. On a cold December night in 1884, Elena went into labor. The midwife arrived and took over the bedroom while Kade paced the main room of their house, anxiety eating at him. Thomas sat calmly in one of Kade's chairs, but even his composed exterior couldn't hide his worry. Hours passed. Kade couldn't hear what was happening in the other room, and the not knowing was torture. He kept moving toward the bedroom door only to have Thomas intercept him and guide him back. The older man's lips moved, but Kade was too distressed to focus on reading them. Finally, as dawn began to break, the midwife emerged. Her face was tired but smiling. She gestured for Kade to come, and he practically ran into the bedroom. Elena lay in the bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. When she saw him, she smiled and spoke slowly. "Come meet your son." Kade approached on shaking legs. Elena pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, eyes squeezed shut, mouth opening and closing. His son. His child. The emotion was so overwhelming that Kade had to sit down on the edge of the bed before his legs gave out. Elena placed the baby in his arms, and Kade looked down at the tiny person they had created. The baby's mouth opened wide, and Kade knew he was crying, though he couldn't hear it. Elena touched his face to get his attention and spoke slowly. "We should name him after your father." "What was his name?" Kade felt his throat tighten with emotion. He spoke carefully. "Kenneth." "Kenneth James Garrison." Elena smiled and nodded. She signed, "Kenneth, Kenny, it is perfect." Thomas came in to meet his grandson, and the old man's eyes were wet with happy tears as he held the baby. They spent the morning together as a family, marveling at the new life they had brought into the world. Kade couldn't stop staring at his son, couldn't stop feeling amazed that something so perfect had come from him. The early days of parenthood were challenging but joyful. Kenny was a healthy baby with strong lungs, which meant he cried frequently, though of course Kade couldn't hear it. Elena developed a system of alerts, touching Kade's shoulder or arm whenever the baby needed attention. At night, they took turns with Kenny, and Kade marveled at how natural Elena made motherhood look. As Kenny grew, Kade watched anxiously for any signs of hearing problems. But the baby responded to sounds, turning his head toward his mother's voice, startling at loud noises. He could hear perfectly, and Kade felt relief and a strange sort of bittersweet emotion. His son would never know the particular isolation that Kade lived with, but it also meant they would never share that specific understanding. Elena seemed to sense his thoughts. One evening, as they sat together watching Kenny sleep in his cradle, she touched Kade's face and spoke slowly. "He will grow up knowing both worlds, speaking and signing, sound and silence. He will understand you in ways most people never could." Kade nodded, comforted by her words. She was right, as she so often was. Kenny would be raised in a household where communication took many forms, where disability was just another aspect of life to be accommodated and worked around, not a tragedy to be mourned. As Kenny grew from baby to toddler, he indeed learned to navigate both worlds seamlessly. His first words were spoken, but his first real communication had been sign language, the simple gestures that Elena and Kade used constantly. By the time he was 2 years old, Kenny could switch effortlessly between speaking to his mother and grandfather and signing with his father. Kade found deep joy in these interactions with his son. Kenny would run to him and sign rapidly with his small hands, telling him about a bug he had found or a bird he had seen. Kade would respond in kind, and Elena would watch them with a soft smile, her two favorite people in the world communicating in their own special language. The mine continued to prosper, and Kade expanded his carpentry business as well. He hired several workers and built a proper workshop in town. His furniture became known throughout the territory for its quality and craftsmanship, and he began to receive orders from as far away as Phoenix and Tucson. Thomas's health remained good, and he seemed to have found new purpose in life as both a grandfather and a valued member of the mining community. He had a small house near Kade and Elena, close enough to visit daily, but far enough to give the young family their privacy. When Kenny was 3 years old, Elena told Kade she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because they knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a warm June evening in 1888, and they named her Catherine after Elena's mother. She had Elena's green eyes and Kade's dark hair, and from the moment she arrived, she was loved fiercely by her entire family. Kenny was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. He would sit beside Elena and sign to the baby, telling her stories even though she was too young to understand. Kade would watch his son with wonder, seeing how naturally Kenny navigated a world with both hearing and deaf members. As the children grew, the Garrison household became known throughout Oatman as a place of warmth and welcome. Elena frequently invited neighbors and friends for meals, and their table was always full. Many people in town learned at least basic sign language, so they could communicate with Kade directly rather than always going through Elena or Thomas. Kade had never imagined feeling so integrated into a community. After losing his hearing, he had resigned himself to a life on the margins, always slightly apart from everyone else. But Elena had changed everything. She had shown him that disability didn't have to mean isolation, that communication was possible through many channels, that love could bridge any gap. One evening when Kenny was 7 and Catherine was 4, they all sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become a family tradition, this quiet time together at the end of each day. Kenny was teaching Catherine a new sign he had learned, his small hands moving patiently as his sister tried to copy him. Elena sat in her rocking chair, the one Kade had made for her all those years ago, with a soft smile on her face. Thomas dozed in another chair, his grandson's hand resting on his knee. Kade looked at his family and felt contentment settle deep in his bones. His life hadn't turned out anything like he had expected. The explosion that took his father and his hearing had seemed like the end of everything. But somehow, through pain and struggle, he had found something better than he ever could have imagined. Elena caught him looking and signed. "What are you thinking about?" He signed back. "How lucky I am. How much I love all of you." She smiled and spoke slowly so the children could see and he could read her lips. "And we love you so very much." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The mine eventually played out, as all mines do, but by then, Kade had diversified enough that the loss didn't hurt them financially. His carpentry business thrived, and he took on apprentices, teaching young men the skills his father had taught him. He was especially patient with a deaf teenager who arrived in Oatman with his family, taking the boy under his wing, and showing him that deafness didn't mean the end of dreams or opportunity. Kenny grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's skill for working with his hands and his mother's love of books. Catherine was spirited and adventurous, always exploring the desert and bringing home interesting rocks and plants. Both children were bilingual in English and sign language, and both grew up understanding that there were many ways to be in the world, many ways to communicate and connect. Thomas lived to see both grandchildren reach adulthood, passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. His death was a blow to the family, but especially to Elena, who grieved the loss of her last parent deeply. Kade held her through the worst of it, his arms a safe place for her sorrow, his presence a reminder that she was not alone. They buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the valley, with a headstone that read, "Thomas Voss, beloved father and grandfather who dared to dream." At the funeral, both Kenny and Catherine spoke about their grandfather, and Kenny also signed the eulogy simultaneously so that his father could follow every word in real time. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the kind of family they were, about the values Kade and Elena had instilled in their children. More years passed. Kenny married a kind young woman named Sarah who had grown up in Oatman and had known sign language since childhood. They gave Kade and Elena 2 grandchildren, both hearing, both taught to sign almost before they could walk. Catherine married a rancher from a neighboring county, and they settled nearby, eventually adding 3 more grandchildren to the growing family. Kade and Elena aged together, their love deepening with each passing year. The house that Kade had built grew and expanded as their family grew, with additions and modifications to accommodate visits from children and grandchildren. Elena's hair turned silver and Kade's face gained lines and weathering from years in the desert sun. But when they looked at each other, They still saw the young people who had met beside a broken wagon wheel so many years before. They still met by a campfire sometimes, just the two of them, sitting as they had that first night when Elena had spoken slowly and carefully until Kade smiled. She would tell him stories, and he would watch her lips form the words, understanding her perfectly after decades of practice. And sometimes, they would just sit in comfortable silence, holding hands, needing no words at all because their hearts had learned to speak to each other without any language but love. On an evening in 1910, when Kade was 51 and Elena was 49, they sat on their porch watching another sunset. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter silent to Kade but visible in their joyful expressions. Kenny and Catherine were both visiting with their families, and the house was full of noise and life and happiness. Elena took Kade's hand and signed. "Are you happy?" He signed back. "More than I ever thought possible. You gave me everything," she signed. "We gave each other everything." And it was true. They had built a life together that neither could have created alone. Elena had learned to speak Kade's language, and Kade had learned to love without reservation. Together, they had created a family that understood that communication came in many forms, that disability was just another aspect of being human, that love was the most important language of all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to appear in the vast Arizona sky, Kade pulled Elena close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat that way as darkness fell. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting in the harsh desert, who had proven that sometimes the best conversations happen not with words but with hearts that have learned to listen to each other in the deepest silence. Their grandchildren eventually came to sit at their feet, begging for stories. Kenny settled nearby with his wife, and Catherine joined them with her husband. The whole family gathered there on the porch, 3 generations of Garrisons and the family they had married into, all of them able to communicate in the special languages that Kade and Elena had pioneered together. Elena began to tell a story, speaking slowly and clearly as she always did when Kade needed to follow along. It was the story of how they had met, of a broken wagon wheel and an act of kindness, of campfires and slowly spoken words, of falling in love across a gap that seemed impossible to bridge. The grandchildren had heard it before, but they never tired of it. This story of their grandparents' romance. Kade watched Elena's face as she spoke, her lips forming each word with the same care she had shown him from the very beginning. Even after all these years, even though he could anticipate every word of this familiar story, he still felt his heart swell with love as he watched her speak. She was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and her willingness to meet him in his silent world was still the greatest gift he had ever received. When she finished the story, the children clapped and signed their appreciation. The youngest grandchild, barely 3 years old, climbed into Kade's lap and signed. "I love you, Grandpa," Kade signed back. "I love you too, sweetheart." The little girl curled against his chest, her warmth and weight grounding him in this moment, in this life he had built. He looked up to find Elena watching him, and the expression on her face was so full of love and contentment that it took his breath away. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed or returned to their own homes, Kade and Elena lay together in the bedroom they had shared for 26 years. The window was open to let in the cool night air, and moonlight spilled across the floor. Elena turned to face him, and even in the dimness he could see her clearly. She spoke slowly. "Thank you for giving me this life, for being the man you are, for loving me the way you do." He spoke back, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for learning my language, for building this family with me. You are my everything." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, the same kiss they had shared thousands of times over the years, but somehow always new, always meaningful. When they broke apart, she signed, "I would choose you again. In every life, in every world, I would always choose you." He signed back, "And I would choose you. Always." They fell asleep holding each other, two souls who had found their perfect match, two hearts that beat as one even in the silence. Outside their window, the desert stretched away in all directions, vast and eternal, the same landscape that had witnessed the beginning of their love story and would remain long after they were gone. But here in this house, in this room, in this bed, Kade and Elena had created something that would outlast them both, a love that would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the lessons they had taught about communication and understanding, in the example they had set of how two people could build a bridge across any divide. The years continued to roll forward as they do for everyone. Kade and Elena celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th, then their 40th. They moved a bit slower, tired a bit more easily, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by time and tested by life's inevitable challenges. Kenny took over the carpentry business when Kade's hands began to ache too much for fine detail work. Catherine and her husband purchased land adjoining Kade and Elena's property, building a house where they could be close to the family. The grandchildren grew, and some of them started having children of their own, making Kade and Elena great-grandparents, a development that delighted them both. Through it all, they maintained their evening ritual of sitting together as the sun set. Even when Kade's health began to decline in his mid-60s, even when Elena developed arthritis that made her hands stiff and painful, they still met on the porch each evening. Sometimes they signed to each other. Sometimes Elena spoke slowly and Kade read her lips. Sometimes they simply held hands and watched the sky change colors, needing no words because their connection had transcended language long ago. On a warm spring evening in 1924, when Kade was 65 and Elena was 63, they sat together as they always did. The sunset was particularly spectacular that evening, bands of orange and pink and purple stretching across the entire sky. Their great-grandson, a boy of 5, played nearby with a wooden horse that Kade had carved for him. Elena turned to Kade and signed, "Do you remember the first time we sat by a campfire together?" He signed back, "Of course. You spoke so slowly that I could understand every word." It was the first time since losing my hearing that I felt truly connected to another person. She signed, "I was so nervous. I wanted so badly to communicate with you, to know you. I had never met anyone like you before." He signed, "And I had never met anyone who tried so hard to understand me. Most people gave up, but not you." She signed, "How could I give up? Even then I knew you were special. Even then I think I was falling in love." He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her weathered fingers gently. He signed with his free hand, "You are the love of my life, my heart, my home. Everything good in my life came from meeting you." She signed, "And everything good in mine came from you. We built something beautiful together, didn't we?" He looked out at the yard where their great-grandson played, at the house they had filled with love and life, at the land they had made their own. He signed, "Yes, we built something beautiful." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared. The little boy brought his wooden horse to show his great-grandfather, and Kade admired it with exaggerated appreciation that made the child giggle. Elena watched them with soft eyes, her heart full to bursting with love for her husband and the legacy they had created together. That night they lay in bed and Elena curled against Kade's side as she had done for 40 years. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat strong and steady beneath her palm. She looked up at him and spoke slowly. "I love you more today than I did yesterday. And I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." He spoke back. "And I love you more with each breath I take. You are my reason for everything." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, two lives so intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. More years passed, each one precious, each one savored. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a huge gathering of family and friends. The mayor of Oatman gave a speech about how Kade and Elena had helped shape the town into a more inclusive community, how their example had taught an entire generation about the importance of accessibility and communication. It was a beautiful tribute, and Elena made sure Kade could follow every word. Kade's health declined more noticeably in his 70s, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Elena never wavered. When he could no longer walk easily, Kenny built him a wheeled chair, and Elena would push him around their property so he could still see his beloved desert landscape. When his hands became too arthritic to sign clearly, Elena learned to read the smallest movements of his fingers, understanding him even when no one else could. On a cool November evening in 1933, Kade sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. He was 74 years old, and he knew his time was growing short. Elena sat beside him, holding his hand, her hair completely white now, but her eyes still that same brilliant green he had fallen in love with 50 years before. He looked at her and signed slowly, painfully. "Thank you." She signed back, for what he signed, for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for this life, for every single day. "Thank you." Tears ran down her face as she signed. "Thank you for choosing me, for building this family with me, for showing me what real love means. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." He smiled, the same smile she had fallen in love with so long ago by a campfire in the desert. He signed. "I would do it all again, every moment. Just to be with you." She signed. "Rest now. I am here. I will always be here." He closed his eyes, still holding her hand, and Elena kept her vigil beside him as the stars came out one by one. Their children and grandchildren gathered quietly, filling the porch and spilling into the yard, all of them wanting to be close for whatever came next. Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep that night, with Elena's hand in his and his family surrounding him with love. He slipped away as gently as a sunset fading into darkness, his final expression one of peace and contentment. Elena grieved deeply, but she didn't fall apart. She had loved Kade with everything she had, but he had also taught her to be strong, to adapt, to keep moving forward. She continued to live in their house, surrounded by the furniture he had made and the memories they had created. Their children and grandchildren visited constantly, making sure she was never alone unless she wanted to be. She lived for another 12 years, long enough to see great-great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that the family she and Kade had created would continue to grow and thrive. She spent her final years telling stories about Kade, making sure that every new generation knew about the deaf cowboy who had taught an entire community about love and communication, and the importance of seeing each person as whole and valuable exactly as they were. Elena Garrison passed away in her sleep on a warm June night in 1945 at the age of 84. She was found the next morning in her rocking chair on the porch, the chair Kade had made for her more than 60 years before, a peaceful smile on her face. In her lap was a worn notebook, the same one they had used to communicate in those early days, filled with precious words written by both their hands. They buried her next to Kade on the hill overlooking the valley, under a sky as big and open as their love had been. The entire town of Oatman attended the funeral, along with countless family members and friends whose lives had been touched by the Garrisons' remarkable love story. The house they had built together remained in the family, passed down through generations. The furniture Kade had crafted was carefully preserved and treasured. The traditions they had established continued, with each new generation learning sign language alongside spoken English, understanding that communication took many forms and all of them were valuable. And on certain evenings, when the sunset painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold and purple, family members would gather on that same porch and tell the story of how it all began. They would speak of a broken wagon wheel and a deaf cowboy who offered help without expecting anything in return. They would tell of a young woman who learned to speak slowly and carefully so that he could understand her, who learned his language and created new ones with him, who loved him so completely that she changed not just his life but the entire community around them. The story of Kade and Elena Garrison became a legend in Oatman, a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle, to bridge any gap, to create beauty and meaning even in the harsh desert. Children grew up hearing about them, learning from their example that disability was not a barrier to a full and joyful life, that communication required patience and creativity, that love was the greatest force in the world. Their great-great-grandchildren, some hearing and some deaf, continued to live in Arizona, carrying forward the legacy of inclusivity and understanding that Kade and Elena had begun. The workshop where Kade had taught carpentry became a community center where deaf and hearing people worked side by side. The mine that had made their fortune was long since closed, but the wealth it had provided was used to establish programs teaching sign language and supporting deaf education throughout the territory. Decades after Elena's death, a historian researching the development of Oatman came across records of the Garrison family and became fascinated by their story. She interviewed the living descendants and compiled their memories into a book that told the story of Kade and Elena's love, of how two people had found each other across silence and created something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. The book became popular and inspired other communities to think more carefully about accessibility and inclusion. Schools began incorporating sign language into their curricula. Businesses in the Southwest started making efforts to ensure deaf customers could be served easily. The ripples of what Kade and Elena had started spread far beyond what they ever could have imagined. But perhaps the greatest testament to their love was simply in the family they had created, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and beyond who grew up knowing that love could transcend any barrier. That communication was a gift to be cherished and worked for, that every person deserved to be seen and heard and valued exactly as they were. On the 100th anniversary of Kade and Elena's first meeting in 1983, the town of Oatman held a celebration. Descendants of the Garrison family came from all over the country, filling the small desert town to overflowing. They gathered on the spot where that broken wagon wheel had brought Kade and Elena together, and they told stories and shared memories and celebrated the remarkable love that had started everything. A monument was erected on the hill where Kade and Elena were buried, a beautiful sculpture of two hands signing the word for love. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "Kade and Elena Garrison, who taught us that true communication comes from the heart and that love speaks a language all its own." As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and purple, the family gathered around the monument. The oldest living descendant, Kade and Elena's great-great-granddaughter, who was 93 years old, stood before the crowd. She had been taught sign language by Elena herself as a child, and she remembered her great-grandmother with perfect clarity. She signed as she spoke, her hands moving through the familiar gestures that connected her to her ancestors. My great-grandparents taught us that obstacles are only as big as we allow them to be. They showed us that love requires effort and creativity and patience, but that the reward is worth any amount of work. They proved that disability is not limitation, that silence can be filled with profound communication, that two hearts can find each other even when the world tries to keep them apart. She paused and looked out at the gathered crowd, at the mix of hearing and deaf people, at the children signing to their parents and the adults translating for their elderly relatives, at the beautiful tapestry of communication and inclusion that Kade and Elena had made possible. But most importantly, she continued, they showed us that love endures. It outlasts us. It echoes forward through time in the lives we touch and the children we raise and the communities we build. Kade and Elena's love didn't end when they died. It lives on in every one of us, in every conversation we have, in every effort we make to understand and be understood, in every hand we extend to help someone else. As she finished speaking, the sun dipped below the horizon and someone began to sing an old hymn that had been a favorite of Elena's. Those who could hear sang along while those who were deaf signed the words, creating a beautiful harmony of sound and gesture, of speaking and signing, of hearing and silence, all woven together into something that transcended any single form of communication.